morning, James, Kristina.
Morning.
James, so I see this U.S. Army pin. Is the Army Corps of Engineers really Army?
It is Army. It's part of the Department of Army, but one of the challenges we have is a lot of people think that everybody working for the Corps of Engineers is military. There's actually about 35,000 folks working for the Corps of Engineers. Of that, about 700, only about between 600 and 700 are actually military. It's run by a three-star general, and then there's several two-stars, and myself as a civilian, I'm equivalent to a two-star general in something called
Are there
the
enough
Executive
of you?
Service. Of course there's enough of us. No, I mean, we don't, the Corps of Engineers doesn't try to hire enough people to do all the work that we do. We leverage industry quite a bit, actually, between AE firms and construction firms. We hire all construction firms to do our work. I'd say about 98% of our work is done by industry.
Let me ask you both. I mean, Kristina, one of the things I've been interested in is the complete dour mood about infrastructure, right? So you've just come out with this every 4 years kind of report on infrastructure. You give America basically a D+. You guys kind of don't necessarily give many A's in your work. I guess my question on this is, given how dire things sound, is that your business, basically, to keep blowing the whistle on how bad things are? And have you ever given an A grade?
I don't know that it's our business to keep blowing the whistle, but it is our business to protect the public health, safety, and welfare.
Right.
And our infrastructure is not meeting our needs today in the United States. And so as civil engineers, we are the primary advocates for our infrastructure, and we are making sure that everyone is aware the infrastructure is not meeting our needs, and it's costing us daily.
I went through that report. We talked last night about the reports, and you've given just virtually everything except rail a D or a C, mostly Ds. And can you just walk us through what some of your major concerns are in the country today? And is there, I guess how to put it, an expiration date where it's sort of the end of days and things just begin going, systemically?
Well, I think we're there, right? We are seeing bridge failures. We're seeing water main breaks. We're seeing failures on a consistent basis, which is why the grades are so low. Some of those grades, sometimes we talk about the grades being quality of life issues, and I travel a lot, so I look at airports, and airports are at capacity. Many of our airports are at capacity, and so that's a challenge if you're a traveler. It's also a challenge if you're going somewhere for business and you can't get there. It's an economic challenge, and it's a health and safety challenge. You just spoke with DC Water earlier today. We talked a lot about the challenges with water with Flint. It's something that impacts our families. It's $3,400 a year spent per family on infrastructure that's failing, and it doesn't need to be that way. We can afford to fix it, and we will save money in doing so.
James, with your folks in the Army Corps of Engineers, maybe you can demystify that. What is your role in basically laying out and dealing with some of these infrastructure deficits? When I hear about the Army Corps, it's usually with regard to large-scale infrastructure projects that either did or didn't happen. Your ratings on things like levees. After Katrina, the Army Corps ratings on those levees was a big point of discussion. But when we're not having a disaster, we don't usually hear about the Army Corps. So what are you guys doing when there's not a disaster?
Well, so a lot of what the Corps is doing is actually the things that Kristina mentioned, which is we're trying to actually, I'll say, put Band-Aids on a lot of these projects and try to make sure that people's quality of life is not affected. The Corps of Engineers largely, the civil works portion that I'm responsible for, right, dredges rivers and keeps harbors and ports open so that as long as you can go to, say, your Best Buy or your Walmart and you can pay $1,000 for a large screen TV, then nobody really pays attention to what the Corps is doing. But if we stop dredging those rivers and keeping those ports open, then everything has to travel by rail, or more things travel by rail and by highway, and so then the cost goes up. Mm-hmm. And so one of the battles we constantly fight is trying to make sure we keep our waterways open. The other is the Corps of Engineers is responsible for about 700 dams, about 14,000 miles of levees. And so that's really a key part of flood risk reduction. And so a lot of the damage that does not happen or a lot of the exposure to floods are based on us maintaining those dams and levees that we're responsible for.
What is the backlog you guys have on projects?
The backlog is pretty staggering, and so it's the kind of numbers that people hear it, and we can't get our arms around it. For instance, we've got a backlog of $76 billion of construction projects. And if you think about that $76 billion, if you look at our budget, once a year we get $1 billion, let's say in round numbers. So if nothing else happens, that's 76 years to finish the things that are currently on the books. We currently have a backlog of studies, and studies mean that we're looking at what communities have said to us, we have a problem and we'd like for somebody to come and do something about it. We've got a backlog of 95 of those studies that either are ongoing or we're trying to finish up, and then that adds to the requirement of the $76 billion. So we have to do something different as a nation rather than count on the federal government to fund all of that, because we as taxpayers don't have, I think, the wherewithal to pay another $76 billion to try and finish all of that. So we're looking at a lot of alternative financing.
What kind of models come to mind?
You know, the easy model is to look at what happens with highways. I mean, for those of us that live around here, we got express lanes, we got toll roads, and so I'll take my money and go out and build a toll road or build a road, and then I'll take the tolls for the next 20 years, 30 years to pay for that plus deliver profit. The challenge with a lot of our projects is you take a dam safety project, and what private investor wants to take responsibility for flood risk reduction, and what's the revenue stream for that if you take it over? So there is a challenge, and we're trying to work through that right now.
Kristina, when you look at the financing questions and what we looked at, and again, it was a topic, we happened to have a dinner last evening where we had a gentleman at dinner who was very confident that a lot more could be done in the private sector. And as I read your report, it showed that there was basically a $4 trillion deficit right now in the United States in infrastructure. And I was intrigued that you thought $2 trillion could come from private sources and $2 trillion needed to come from government. If that $2 trillion, and you know, at the height, what Donald Trump's administration had kind of said it was committed to was $1 trillion, which doesn't seem like it's, you know, hurrying its way forward. So what is the financing future if you've got $2 trillion sitting out there on the private side, if that's true? How do you get beyond the absence of federal government investment?
So the deficit is a $2 trillion deficit, and we're spending gap between now and 2025. And the investment for that, where do we come up with the funding for that? It has to come from all levels, not just private, not just federal. It has to also come from state and local. And the hope is that any federal investment can leverage the local and private investment. One of the things that we've been seeing is where the federal government hasn't acted, our states and localities have. So for instance, over half of our states have increased their state transportation tax. So we are working on finding solutions at all levels, even when the federal government hasn't acted.
From an infrastructure perspective, what states are most impressive to you?
You know, I think all of them are really working to find the solutions to meet their needs. There are some localities that are doing some really great things. Seattle, for one, is doing some fantastic things with smart infrastructure, with their transportation infrastructure, recognizing that they need to very efficiently and effectively use their existing transportation infrastructure and finding ways to not just move cars, but to move people, finding ways to maximize the benefit out of their existing infrastructure and modify it as needed to do so.
So Seattle's number one. What would be your top list?
I don't know that I want to say a city is number one.
Oh, come on.
Work with all
Yeah.
But the,
Okay, tell us who's worst.
that's almost as bad, right? but I'll follow with what.
But don't
what
we
Kristina
need, I mean,
said.
I don't mean to be facetious about it or silly. What I find interesting is when states are performing or cities are performing and they're getting it right, don't they deserve the spotlight of saying good job? And if somebody's not getting it right and they're paralyzed or performing badly, shouldn't we put a spotlight and say, hey, that's not going well, and folks should know it? I don't understand this resistance of actually giving credit where credit's due.
Well, I think, at least from the Corps' point of view, and this is where it gets complicated, because I agree with you that those that are doing well should be rewarded. But typically, a lot of times what happens is, I'll take the state of California, who I think is very progressive with flood risk reduction. And so because they go out and do a lot of things, then when it comes time for us to do a study and determine what are the benefits of a specific project, well, if they've done a lot of the work ahead of time, then the benefits are lower. So in that sense, it looks like that they're not being rewarded for the good work they've done, whereas a city that does nothing, and if you go there and do a study and it's like, wow, a lot of benefit, so this project becomes a higher priority. So there's a number of things that we're working with the administration to take a look at. For instance, maybe adjusting the cost sharing. For instance, if you have a community that does good, maybe their cost sharing is different than a community that doesn't. Maybe it raises their priority. I'm not real sure. The administration is looking at trying to leverage that, say, $1 trillion of private industry with about $200 billion or so of federal funding, which would include incentives to do some of the things you're talking about, which is recognize and reward those that are doing well.
You know, one of the other elements of how we just had these massive hurricanes come through. It was apparently a big hurricane year. We saw Naples, Florida, Miami, of course, Houston and others hit so hard. And so one of the words that's become a kind of catchphrase in a lot of these discussions is resilience and resiliency and a resilience officer. How has the greater awareness about the needs for investments in resilience changed the infrastructure dynamic?
So we've been talking, as ASE, we've been talking about sustainable and resilient infrastructure for decades now, and really focusing on building not just the project right, but building the right project. And part of that is, looking at its overall sustainability, social, economic, and environmental, but also looking at its resilience. We can't afford, if we have a $2 trillion investment at GAP, we can't afford to build infrastructure multiple times. So that has to be part of the equation, is looking at what the risk of failure is and how we can build it to mitigate that risk.
And when you go back and you say you've been saying this for decades, I mean, one, I'd ask you, were people hearing you? Because I'm not sure they were. But secondly, with climate change, how much of that infrastructure are sort of now mistakes? You didn't think big enough. We're not anticipating what's going on in climate well enough, given where the big infrastructure projects of the past.
So I think while we've been talking about it for decades, it's starting to really resonate. So we've been working on it, we've been trying to advance it, but as unfortunately with climate change and with some of these very significant catastrophes, natural hazards, catastrophes that we've had, disasters, it's starting to resonate, and we're really starting to see change in the industry. And we're also learning from what we've done in the past. I think one of the things about infrastructure is we're constantly growing, we're constantly adapting, and we're constantly learning. Would we build the Brooklyn Bridge today the same as we did then? No. We would build something different, better. And so we're constantly changing, and we're learning.
James, in the Army Corps of Engineers, are you allowed to admit climate change exists?
We design for future conditions. So there's no question in my mind, in our minds, there is a change in the climate. Sea level rise is pretty obvious, depending on what parts of the country you go in. We've got much more drought and longer drought than we've had in the past. A lot of times we focus on floods. So we are considering, as part of our designs, we're looking at the things that we have in the past not given consideration to, such as sea level rise, such as developing drought contingency plans for our reservoirs. And so, yes, I mean, we recognize climate change is a phenomenon out there that we have to deal with. The other thing I'd say about resilience is that I absolutely agree with Kristina that, we've used these words for an engineer to say we're designing something with resilience in mind is not something new. This is what we as engineers are trained to do. I mean, if you think about safety factors in a foundation design against sliding, factor of safety of 2, et cetera, those kind of things are to add resilience into our designs. But now we need to go a step beyond that and look at things that we call systems. For instance, if you look at a dam and you make a dam as robust as you can against whatever might be coming, it doesn't do any good if the levees downstream are not able to withstand and hold water back in that channel. So we hadn't looked at things as a complete system so much in the past as we're trying to do now. The challenge with that, of course, is the way authorities, appropriations, and things like that come out in a federal budget. But that is what I think communities are working on. Most of them have, a lot of communities have a chief resilience officer that's looking at things in a more comprehensive way.
James, one of the things I've been interested in as I was digging into kind of where we were as a country and infrastructure, I was reading about this big tunnel that's just been not completed, but the tunnel's been dug in Seattle, looking at strengthening Hoover Dam and the kinds of things are happening. And a lot of it deals with real big, staggering leaps in technology. Looking at new materials for roads that are porous, that bring water in, because one of the things we saw in Houston was just the lack of ability to absorb that water and moisture, and people were saying this was a design flaw, this was a design mistake in the way concrete was put forward in Houston, and that a lot of that could have been mitigated by better design. So there's design, there's technology, and I'm just interested in what are the most exciting technological pieces of this that the layperson may not be aware of that has become part of the smart infrastructure future we hope to have.
I think
when we get from a level D+ or D- to maybe a B.
Well, one message I'd say that we definitely want to leave is that we will not get from a D- to a B with just using new technology. It's going to take some amount of funding to work that magic. But there are a number of things that we're investing in terms of research and development to try and make improvements and do things better than we've done them in the past. And so new materials, I mean, it's not new, but it's the application of, for instance, self-healing concrete is something that in the past we didn't use as much. Form a crack, water gets into it, and there's a reaction in which it helps to seal and heal itself. We're looking at how to actually do, for instance, construction a lot better than we've done in the past, meaning a lot faster, a lot more efficient. Most of us get very annoyed at driving down the highway and you run into a detour and you got gravel that's pitting against your car and you run into potholes, et cetera. But we also are annoyed when the construction takes 5 years to complete and you got a lot of detours. So we're looking at how can we better take advantage of pre-engineered methods, strategies, prefab type things, not new, but maybe new and different applications of it.
Kristina, what do you think about the technology front?
So technology is really transforming a lot of things in our industry. We're looking at seeing sensors being put into our water system so that we can detect leaks immediately and fix them. And so prioritize how we're upgrading our network. As George mentioned earlier, we have things that were built a century or more ago, and we have things that are built today, and how do you put those together? Well, the sensors are helping us make sure that we're managing those leaks as they happen. We're also putting sensors into our bridges and using drone technology to help do inspections. That enables us to see faults that maybe the human eye can't see when we used to do them with a visual inspection. And it also enables us to see, to help repair them as we notice the failures and faults. But then there's other really cool technologies out there. I mean, we've been talking about AV and autonomous vehicles and what that's going to do to transform the way we move as people. But we need to work on that, and we need to work on making sure that we develop policies that enable us to see the benefits. We've talked about zombie cars, right? Like if the cars are just driving around by themselves, is that going to increase congestion? Are we going to be able to realize all the benefits? So there's some.
And just before I go to the audience, for your questions, I'm interested in how you guys became you in a way, and whether I wasn't being facetious when I asked, are there enough of you? If you have engineers today, people who are studying and going to become engineers, why become a civil engineer where there's so much darkness and cynicism? Instead, become like a software engineer and work for Facebook. As you look at the kind of challenge of talent out there, are the pipelines, excuse the pun, solid enough and flowing well enough of talent to your fields?
We are constantly working on recruiting more engineers, and really the reason
You have enough?
We have enough for now. We do continually need more. There's a good conversation about generational differences and generational sizes, right? So we definitely are going to need more, and our population is growing, so the needs for infrastructure are growing. What we have today isn't going to meet the needs of tomorrow, so we need more civil engineers, and the reason to become one is we truly are a people-serving profession. the condition of our infrastructure is not great, right? We've talked about that. But I don't think the prospects of us, I don't think it's dour. I don't think it's sad. I think it's very exciting to be able to help improve the quality of life for all of us, for our friends, our family. I think it's one of the best and highest callings.
James?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, a civil engineer, to me, the people that we go out and recruit, and when we talk to even middle school students, what we tend to show them and talk about is what the benefits are, how you can actually hold back water, how you can actually make ships go faster, better, et cetera, and show them the benefits of working in civil engineering. And for most folks that we attract in civil engineering, I mean, you have to have, and you have a passion for doing something, for the good of the population. And that really is what it's all about. A lot of people don't really understand what a civil engineer does, and I think so. Part of our education, part of the things that ASCE has done and continues to do is to try and keep people more informed and aware of what civil engineers do. If you haven't seen, for instance, the film Dream Big, I think that, if nothing else, I took several people to go in and see that film that I'm trying to influence within my own family to see, here's what a civil engineer does, and it makes a difference. It's not so much doing the software as it is software engineers, as it is you're helping the general public live a better life.
Thank you, thank you. Well, let me open the floor to questions, thoughts, and comments. Yes, right here in the back. Good morning.
Hi, I'm Brenna Thorpe, who's Allen Hamilton. I support military energy, and I'm interested in both of your thoughts on kind of the crux now between civil engineering and also cybersecurity and systems and programs, and how much you take into account in your evaluations and your work with the Army Corps, the vulnerabilities and resilience concerns with how automated a lot of systems are now. Terrific. And are continuing to become. From my perspective, I mean, a lot of that has to do with the electric grid, but I imagine that also.
Great question, James.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good question, because one of our challenges now is in the area of cybersecurity or security of our infrastructure. For instance, while we sought to get a lot of things, our locking dams, our dam operations automatic, that also makes them more vulnerable. So what we're doing now as part of our critical infrastructure program is we're actually taking each one of those facilities and doing an assessment to try and determine what must we do to eliminate, to remove that vulnerability from those. And that by itself adds another factor of cost into our entire requirements. But what we are trying to do is, as we go out and rehab a particular facility, a dam or a locking dam, is we're trying to address the security issues at that point in time.
John.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. A lot of attention is given to the big billion-dollar projects, the major freeway, the bridge, but on the smaller scale, there are a lot of suburban roads that were built without sidewalks. We have city sidewalks that were last maintained under FDR. Did your scorecard look at that side of infrastructure, the pedestrian level?
Kristina?
So our report card looks at transportation as a whole. We look at roads, bridges, transit. So we are looking and considering how do we best move people. And the DC Metro would not work without the metro system and the transit system. And once you get on or off that system, you have to be able to walk or bike to your final destination. So that's definitely part of the report card, and it's part of our solutions as we look forward to meeting the needs of our traveling public. Yeah.
Before we go, because we had the DC Water Works, I was intrigued that you give a D to Americans' water system and sent, at least, drinking water. But what do you give the DC itself? We had George up here. He seems more fun and cool than a D. What's the grade you give DC?
If only we were rating people, right?
Yeah.
So I believe that the DC, so we have the national report card, which looks at a very macro level, and then our states and some of our regions also do local report card efforts. And I believe that the DC Water is now at a C, and they're looking forward to improving beyond that.
Oh, yay on a C. Mom and Dad, I got a C.
But that's because they actually were lower but they've invested in their infrastructure and as a result have improved their grade.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Kristina Swallow with the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thank you. James Dalton, Director of Civil Works with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you both very much. Thank you.